was your age, I never chased a boy or called a boy or sat in a parked car with a boy.
1955 Lorraine is sexually active, confident, and assertive. She's also very likable, in contrast to her grumpy, middle-aged personality. In this way, the Madonna-whore dichotomy preached by 1985 Lorraine is effectively torn down. She was never a good girl, whatever that is. She was a normal, horny teenager, just as you would expect to find in a 1985 high school, if a bit exaggerated for the sake of humor. In 1985, she has forgotten what it feels like to be a teen, and she hypocritically condemns Jennifer for her sexual desires and assertiveness. As a result, all of what she says about it being wrong for girls to chase boys can be completely dismissed. It's also interesting to see that 1955 Lorraine is so sexually active in light of her conflict with Biff. She's not that kind of girl when it's about having sex with Biff, but she's extremely sexually assertive with Marty and thinks that it's silly he's surprised she's into parking. This indicates to me that the film was made with the right conceptualization of female sexual desire as equivalent to male sexual desire in terms of it being about lust as opposed to political action. There's a pervasive sexist notion about women not really being sexual and only desiring sex for social power, at least women of a certain class.
She knows she's the one with the real power.
What power?
Well, the same power that all women have.
This fits in with the Madonna-whore dichotomy, where the Madonna is considered honorable for practicing abstinence, and the whore is considered to have chosen a lifestyle of giving sex to everyone and servicing their sexual needs. There's a class issue that presents the whore role as contemptible. To an extent, the movie mocks the whole notion of the dichotomy.
Marty, you're beginning to sound just like my mother.
At this point, Marty takes a fathering role to his mother in criticizing her drinking and smoking. In 1985, we see her drinking vodka, apparently to deal with the disappointment of not seeing her brother Joey. With George ignoring her, she seems like an unhappy alcoholic.
We all make mistakes in life, children.
In 1955, Marty tries to get Lorraine to recognize the danger of drinking alcohol and complains about her smoking. I think it's important to note that while he is shocked at his mother being so sexual based on his image of her, he doesn't criticize her sexuality in the same way as her drinking and smoking, and the movie ultimately portrays it pretty well. Marty tries to work up the courage to sexually harass Lorraine, but he's a nice guy and can't do it. Even though he and George have this big plan to restore the universe to order, I think that's the right way to deal with it. Sexual assault should not be seen as the means to an end, and being unable to commit that kind of violence, Marty is a good, heroic figure. As it turns out, Lorraine is more than willing to have sex with him and kisses him without a second thought. Fortunately, she instinctively recognizes him as family and backs off. She knows the romance won't work. And then George arrives at the worst possible— no wait, it's Biff. Biff shows up to beat up Marty as retribution for the manure incident. He and his gang are all drunk and violent, and Marty gets completely overpowered. Lorraine tries to help him, but then Biff turns his malevolent attention on her and tries to rape her. The way she crawls forward across the seats makes it so that her breasts are especially visible, and though the camera is positioned to show Biff's point of view, it's not a typical male gaze shot. The audience isn't led to objectify her, but instead to appreciate her as a person with a sexual presence, and to feel fear for her when Biff targets her.
Well, looky what we have here.
Marty fights to get free, but Biff's gang has a strong hold on him. Biff has them put him in someone's trunk. As it turns out, the car belongs to Marvin Berry and the Starlighters, the black musicians hired to play the dance. And they don't take kindly to the bullies. The guy with the 3D glasses uses a racial slur, and there's a cool jazz sound effect as all the band members get out to intimidate them.
Who you calling spook, Peckerwood?
It works, and the bullies are scared off.
What is the essence of cool?
The slang word cool comes from African American culture to describe black people who remain calm in the face of prejudice. The dominant white culture then changed it to make it mean something impressive. Both senses of the word seem applicable to these guys. They're musicians, which already makes them fun, and they calmly work together to scare away racist white bullies. This scene depicts a sanitized version of the racial tensions of the 1950s in a way that honors black people for being cool. In that way, this depiction of racism is not in itself racist. However, the fact that following their confrontation of the bullies, they act in a subordinate capacity to Marty as characters is indicative of racist storytelling that favors white protagonists. They are more or less just spectacle and a setup to a joke about Chuck Berry. Unfortunately, the keys were in the trunk when the door closed, so Marvin has to force it open with a screwdriver. While they're working on that, George shows up to the car thinking that it's Marty doing his thing. He opens the door dramatically and starts to deliver his line, but then sees that it's Biff. He starts to back away in fear, but sees that Lorraine is in real danger, and he does the thing he could never do before and stands up to his arch nemesis Biff. George is presented as a teenager unable to make the transition from childhood to adulthood. He still regularly drinks chocolate milk, doesn't take responsibility, and he's a complete weakling. In a role reversal, Marty acts as George's father and teaches him how to be a man. What a lot of people don't focus on, though, is that before Marty guides him, he's a jerk. He's willing to throw Marty, some guy he's never met, under the bus to escape Biff's bullying. He regularly peeps on Lorraine, he runs away from the car accident, and he thinks that Biff's harassment of Lorraine is some kind of mutual flirtation. He's a jerk, and he's a bit of a misogynist as part of his jerkness. He just doesn't seem to really care about Lorraine, which goes a long way to explain their dysfunctional relationship in 1985. An initial attraction will not substitute for general lack of respect. With Marty's help, he actually comes to care about her, and though Marty did the thing where he dressed as Darth Vader and forced him to get into a relationship with her, I don't think he really cares about that right now. All he sees is Biff, the evil he cowers before, and Lorraine scared and in danger. He wants to obey his usual caution and run away, but he sees her and cares, and that's why he stands up to Biff.
No, Biff. You leave her alone.
Because of that, all the sexist stuff we see him do is acceptable for the narrative. His being a voyeur is bad, but the film recognizes it, and this is part of showing his bad side in a story about him getting better. And then he gets better, and it's a triumph. And this ultimately makes it all feminist. George tries to punch Biff, but Biff grabs him and tries to break his arm. Lorraine ends up trying to attack him herself, but Biff is just too strong. Even though it is ineffective, I like that she is able to use physical aggression on him. He knocks her aside and laughs at her, and this enrages George so much that he finds the strength to punch Biff in the head and knock him out cold. He is now a hero and Lorraine adores him. Though I think there should be room for other stories about women having just as much physical ability as men or more than them, that doesn't mean discounting stories where the woman is physically weaker than the man. That dynamic fits some people, and as long as there isn't any shaming of other dynamics, there isn't, then I think that's just fine. Especially for the 1950s, this is a good way to show respect. The relationship between George and Lorraine is ultimately feminist. They still have to kiss at the dance, though. Marvin hurts his hand getting Marty out of the car, and now he can't play the guitar, so Marty replaces him. It still isn't enough though, and he starts to fade out of existence. There's one more challenge to be had, where George has to save Lorraine from dancing with a jerk who cuts into their dance. It's kind of a letdown from the scene with Biff. It's understandable that Lorraine can't fight off Biff, but not just dancing with some random jerk. Her needing George to fight for her at this point is a bit sexist, but at the same time it is the 1950s and I can understand her being reluctant to be assertive in public. She's assertive in the car with Marty because she's comfortable there, in control. George rescues her from a dance with a jerk and is able to kiss her, securing their romance and saving Marty's life as the music swells in romantic triumph. Marvin then urges Marty to take the lead and play a song that really cooks. This part is racist. Black people are stereotyped as being impressive musicians and appreciable for their talent, and white people write fantasies about joining them and leading. It's fine that Marty joins as a substitute for Marvin and serves one role in the group. This could conceivably happen, but Marvin hands control of the music off to him for no reason. It's kind of like in the film Adventures in Babysitting, when the white family is forced to sing the blues in a black dance club for no reason whatsoever, and everybody gets into it anyway. It says that black people are fun, but in a stereotypical and subordinate capacity. And then there's the Chuck Berry thing. Marty introduces 1955 to rock and roll by singing Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good.
Well, lived a country boy named Johnny Be Good.
While just happening to be dressed like and playing the same guitar as him. It's good that they recognize black people invented rock and roll, not Elvis. Though whether Chuck Berry's the first to play it is a matter of debate, Little Richard also being a good candidate for that. However, Marvin Berry then calls up his cousin Chuck, get it, Chuck Berry, to share Marty's music with him.
You know that new sound you're looking for? Well, listen to this!
This is essentially the Goldie Wilson joke on steroids. While it's still the case that we're working with a version of time travel where you can change the past, as is made clear by the photograph, it flirts so highly with the idea that Marty gave Chuck Berry his career that it is effectively true in this scene. Certainly in this alternate reality that Marty is making, Chuck Berry doesn't develop this new sound on his own. The movie might not be saying that black people can't be successful on their own, but is presenting this version as preferable because it gives the audience, specifically the white part of the audience, a power fantasy about an everyman who, while first rejected from getting to play the big dance, travels into the Adventureland of 1955 and becomes successful enough to play the big dance there, and even be the one that brings something as wonderful as rock and roll to the world. The problem is that it displaces black history from the equation. Chuck Berry himself is a success story about an everyman black guy who influences the rise of rock and roll along with people like Little Richard. The song Johnny Be Good is itself about his humble beginnings and rise to success. In fact, the lyric,
"Where lived a country boy named Johnny Be Good,"
originally used the phrase colored boy. Chuck Berry is a real-life rags to riches story, an example of a black man succeeding despite an institution of racism and forever altering American music. Robert Zemeckis seems to think that this story is made better by having a white kid be the one to introduce this music and act as a power fantasy, with Chuck Berry only as a fan and imitator. That is racist. I think it could have been done better if it was specifically about honoring Chuck Berry instead of just tossing him in as a goofy reference. Instead of having Strickland holding his hands over his ears as a callback to the school official played by Huey Lewis saying he's just too darn loud, maybe they could have had a janitor or something played by Chuck Berry himself with his hands over his ears, thinking his own music is too darn loud. That would have been funny, and it would have honored him as the audition scene honors Huey Lewis. I do think it's a good idea that Marty still play Chuck Berry, though, and not Elvis. Chuck Berry and his black contemporaries did invent the musical genre, and there should be some reflection of that. It's highly probable that most white kids first heard of Chuck Berry through Back to the Future. Anyway, Marty plays Johnny Be Good.
Johnny Be Good.
Everyone loves it until Marty gets a little too 80s for the 50s. Everyone stares at him, and he just heads out. George and Lorraine show up to say goodbye. Marty gives them his blessing and leaves them be.
You're late. You have no concept of time.
Marty and Doc set up the DeLorean and say goodbye. Again, I like that male friendship with open displays of emotion. Doc finds the letter and rips it up, while Marty tries to scream the information at him. I really can't blame either one of them for that, which makes it an honest human drama. And then the storm messes up the power cord, forcing Doc to climb up on the courthouse to try to fix it, while Marty gets the DeLorean into position. Marty decides to reprogram the time circuits to arrive in 1985, 10 minutes before he left, so that he would have time left to warn Doc, but he encounters a dramatically convenient starter problem, and he struggles with that for a bit until he decides to use his head. He starts accelerating down the road. Doc struggles on the clock face, causing a piece of the concrete to crumble off, and making him dangle from the hour hand. He fixes the cord, but causes a second problem and ends up swinging down to fix it. At the exact right second, Doc allows the 1.21 gigawatts of lightning to electrify the suspended cable just as Marty strikes it. The DeLorean vanishes, leaving a pair of fire trails in its wake. Doc does the happy dance. We've established that you can change the past enough to jeopardize your own existence, and that you can fix this, but it's not yet clear the extent to which Marty can change his present. Our first sign that Marty has brought change to his world is the sight of the clock tower. Doc smiles up at the clock tower, and we cut, not to his perspective, but to a shot of the clock tower in 1985. Still with the piece missing from Doc's meddling, which was absent in the original shots of the 1985 clock tower, but that's subtle enough that not many people would have seen it on their first viewing. A police helicopter shines a spotlight around, looking for the terrorists, but only finding a local homeless man sleeping on a bench. Then Marty arrives, crashing into the movie theater. The man gets up to see what's going on, calls Marty a drunk driver, and settles back on the bench. Marty drives back into the square and gets out to admire the features of his 1985 home, including the presence of the homeless man, who he calls Red.
Brett, you look great.
This leads many Back to the Future fans to think that this is in fact Red Thomas, the mayor of 1955. It creates an ironic parallel with Goldie Wilson. Goldie starts out as a lowly restaurant worker, and through the course of 30 years, becomes a successful mayor. Red starts out a successful mayor, and ends up as a cranky homeless guy. With this narrative in place, it really feels like the Goldie Wilson story is in fact deliberately anti-racist. Problem is, Michael J. Fox completely improvised that part. The script just calls him a raggedy bum, and the only function he serves in the narrative is to make the line calling Marty a drunk driver. Michael J. Fox decided that Marty would recognize him as a feature of 1985 Hill Valley and be glad for his presence, and he chose to have Marty look at him and say, "Red." I don't know if Michael J. Fox wanted to indicate that the homeless man was in fact Red Thomas, or if he just picked Red because it sounded like the kind of name a raggedy bum would have. In any case, Robert Zemeckis did not intend to say that the homeless man was Red Thomas. On the other hand, everyone thinks that he is Red Thomas. Tons of Back to the Future sites report the false trivia that the homeless man is in fact Red Thomas, and that the original Red Thomas poster depicts actor Buck Flower instead of Hal Gaussman. As this is such a popular perception, we might consider this a legitimate reading of the film. Michael J. Fox edition can be considered as part of the way films come together from the contributions of many people, as opposed to a single director's vision. So let's say that he is Red Thomas. 1955 has Red in Power and Goldie in Poverty, and 1985 has Goldie in Power and Red in Poverty. So you then have the theme about racism end on a positive note where black people have respect in the present. While it's always good to oppose racism, and it's good to acknowledge achievements in the struggle against the institution, it may not be a good idea to paint the present as this progressive land that has surpassed racism. 1985 was hardly free of racism, no matter how much white people wanted to ignore it. Even now in 2015, there is substantial institutional racism and general disrespect, and this belief that we are somehow past racism because it's not the 1950s only prolongs it. Anyway, the Libyans show up. The DeLorean has another starter problem, probably because of all the gremlins in the area, and Marty has to run to the mall on foot. The mall is no longer the Twin Pines Mall. Marty killed one of the trees, so now it is the Lone Pine Mall. We've now seen 2 instances of Marty changing his present. We now have to see if he managed to make the most important change and save Doc's life. Marty watches the same conflict play out with his other self in 1985 Doc. His other self goes back to 1955, and the Libyans crash into a photo stand. A lot of people interpret this as killing the Libyans, while the intent was to show with the helicopter that the police would arrive and arrest them in a few minutes, which is another example of audience perception creating a different story than the director's intention. In any case, they're out of commission and can't hurt anyone anymore. Marty goes to see if Doc's okay and finds him on the ground with bullet holes in his front. Oh, I guess he's dead. That's a bummer.
Over mountains, over trees, over oceans, over seas.
Oh, of course he was just stunned. He figured, what the hell, and put the letter back together and prepared for the night with a bulletproof vest. Given that Zemeckis tries to fool us by having things play out the same way, a lot of people misunderstand and think that the movie uses cyclic time travel, like Doc was always wearing a bulletproof vest, but that's not true. Doc was dead in the first timeline with the Twin Pines Mall, and now Marty has saved his life in the second timeline with the Lone Pine Mall. Epic friendships for the win! Doc drives Marty home and heads off on his trip to the year 2015. Marty enters his house, and he wakes up in bed. Huey Lewis is on the radio, singing Back in Time.
Take me away, I don't mind, but you better promise me I'll be back in time.
For a moment, it seems like it could all have been a dream, until Marty heads to breakfast and finds the house completely different. Due to his actions in the past of teaching George to stand up for himself and respect Lorraine, they're far more successful and caring people. Now the house is fancily decorated, his brother Dave has a white-collar job, his sister Linda has a rich dating life, and his parents are happily married. I like that the movie stays consistent with its positive portrayal of sexually active teen girls. In the first 1985 timeline, Lorraine's disrespect is portrayed negatively. We feel badly for Linda and Marty because of his connection to Jennifer, having to deal with her bigoted opinions, keeping them from having good dating lives. When we see 1955 Lorraine, we laugh at the hypocrisy, but we also respect her as a sexually active teen girl. Now in the second timeline of 1985, we appreciate Linda being as sexually active as 1955 Lorraine. Second timeline 1985 Lorraine is a better woman because she approves of Jennifer and thinks that Marty's plan to take her to the lake is romantic. The message is that being sexually active is just how teens are, and they should be allowed to express their sexuality. In this timeline, George never let Biff wreck the car. Biff is no longer George's supervisor, and is now a humble auto detailer waxing George's car. Biff tries to con him, but George doesn't fall for it. The reversal of the power disparity is hilarious, as is George's complete acceptance of the scenario. But this joke gets taken a little too far when he and Lorraine appreciate Biff for starting their romance.
If it wasn't for him.
We never would have fallen in love.
That's right.
I know what they're trying to say, but it's not expressed well at all. Biff's antagonism was the reason that George fought for Lorraine and started the romance, but Biff himself should not be appreciated. It's like in Watchmen, where Dr. Manhattan tells Laurie that she should appreciate herself as a miracle that came from the unexpected union between her mother and the comedian, a man who previously tried to rape her. There, he acknowledges the evil man on the way to appreciating the good woman who came from him. Dr. Manhattan is a big picture kind of guy. What George and Lorraine do problematically honors the rapist himself for his part in the big picture. Lorraine should not be this comfortable around Biff. Biff isn't just that jerk who stole a dance with her, he's a real villain. The implication is that he matured into just a jerk, and is harmless because he's subordinate to George. Lorraine and the rest of the family are fine with him running around the house and pretending to be nice to people. I mean, it's funny, but it's insensitive to victims of sexual violence. Anyway, George's weird science fiction dream inspired him to get a published novel, and Marty now owns the truck he admired. Jennifer shows up for a romantic car ride. It's the good end to Marty's hero's journey, and he finally gets to kiss his girlfriend with the approval of his parents. Oh wait, no. Now Doc shows up from his trip to the future. He comes out dressed as everyone in 2015 now dresses. I know I don't leave the house without my opaque metal glasses and shiny yellow trench coat or whatever that is. He tells Marty that Marty and Jennifer are urgently needed to save their kids in 2015. He ushers them into the DeLorean, which is now powered by cold fusion and can fly. It goes into the future and the credits roll. I first saw this movie on VHS, which came out after its 2 sequels had been made. In order to make Back to the Future look like a proper trilogy, they put "To Be Continued" at the end of the first movie. It wasn't until I got the DVD version that I realized that the theatrical version doesn't have "To Be Continued." The movie was intended to be standalone. The part at the end was just a joke. Just after Marty returns home, he has to go on another time-traveling adventure, this time with Jennifer, and about their kids in the future instead of his parents in the past. That's all it is. It would be wrong to interpret it as you would a hook for the sequel, which would be connected with the sequel itself. Jennifer's usage in the scene is different from her usage in Back to the Future Part 2. Though I am disappointed by what the sequel does with her inclusion, as far as this joke implies, she, Doc, and Marty would be equals on the next time-traveling adventure, and it can be appreciated on that level. On the other hand, it really is just including Jennifer as a joke. She's the girlfriend, and then she's the joke. The joke doesn't really appreciate her as a character involved in an important matter, as with the Doc and Marty, so much as fulfilling the role of Marty's future wife, with a joke about Marty's future kids.
It's your kids, Marty. Something has got to be done about your kids.
And so concludes Back to the Future. It's not perfect, but what movie is? It's got stereotyping, Jennifer doesn't have much of a role beyond her relationship with Marty, and the handling of adult Biff in the second timeline is pretty cringeworthy. On the other hand, the movie is really respectful of Lorraine even as it presents her as comedically hypocritical. Biff's harassment of her is properly indicated to be really bad, at least in 1955, and George's bad behavior is recognized as something bad he needs to get past to become a good character. Overall, it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn feminist for what it is. An enjoyable time travel romp.